And let me also look at where is, yes, Pratham, to you.
Sure. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Cool, cool. Yeah. Hi, hello everyone. I, Pratham, on behalf of TheDaak, welcome you all to the 18th session of TheDaak Baithak. A bit about TheDaak. TheDaak began in 2023 as a book review journal publishing original reviews across disciplines and genres. Right from the beginning, we have tried to reimagine the form of the book review itself, encouraging writing that moves beyond summary to engage deeply, creatively, critically, and reflectively with the world that a book opens up for us. Over time, however, we have grown into a biannual academic journal that now includes reviews, explainers, commentaries, and research essays. Our double blind peer review process ensures rigor while our editorial approach values accessibility and creative thought. Beyond the journal, the Dark has grown into a vibrant collective as well. Through our reading groups, we meet every month to discuss a shared book, discovering new perspectives through conversations. Through the Dark Weekly, we publish personal essays, topical reflections, and explainers that extend our conversations into the contemporary moment. The Dark Baithak is a humble attempt to bring scholars, students, writers from different fields to present ideas and initiate dialogue, bringing critical conversations to life. Our session today is titled India's Foreign Policy and Sovereignty Paradox, a Theoretical Framework. Our speaker for today is Dr. Shreejita Biswas. Dr. Shreejita is currently serving as an assistant professor and postgraduate program coordinator at the Department of Political Science, School of Humanities and Social Sciences in Joseph's University, Bangalore. She holds a PhD in international politics from the Center for International Politics, Organization and Disarmament, Jawaharlal University, New Delhi. As a recipient of the ICSSR full term doctoral fellowship, her research interest lies in the areas of international norms, responsibility to protect, humanitarian intervention, foreign policy, and global governance. As discussant today, we have Vidushi. Vidushi is an undergrad student at Hindu College, Delhi University, and is pursuing majors in political science. Her interest is in geopolitics and particularly in Middle Eastern geopolitics. We welcome both the speaker and the discussant for today. As for the format, the invited speaker presents their thought for about 20 to 30 minutes, which is followed by a brief remark slash question slash observation slash comments by the discussant, and then an open floor Q&A with the participants. With this being done, may I now request our speaker for today to begin their session whenever they're ready. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Pratham, for the introduction. So I will straight away try to share my screen once again and okay, 1 minute. Oh, is it visible?
Yes, we can see
Yes,
your,
yes, yes.
we can see. Yeah.
Just just make it full screen. Yeah. So I know the title has been framed in a bit in a different manner, and here the title is framed in a bit in a different manner, but it roughly talks about the same thing. I was just telling Jigyasa that, it's part of the same certificate course that I've taught earlier, so that's why the title is just, roughly here and there, but the overall uh, context of the thing remains the same in terms of how India sees sovereignty as a particular I mean, what is India's understanding of the concept of sovereignty, particularly when it comes to now I would particularly look into it from the perspective of humanitarian intervention and responsibility to protect. That is just to give it a certain, a platform. Otherwise, when we talk about sovereignty, it becomes very broad as a concept. So just to give it some grounding, I'm locating it in the domain of humanitarian intervention and R2P. Now, before proceeding with what is India's understanding of it, just roughly talk about the concept of sovereignty, which I think most of us, being students of political science, are well aware, but still just to, give a background to it, that Sovereignty as a concept, it traces back to the 15th and 16th century when it comes to political theory. And we have certain political theorists like Aristotle, and particularly, if we look into Bodin, all these people, their conceptions of sovereignty has been considered to be the framework of this particular idea, which is, how sovereignty becomes the organizing or fundamental principle of state. So, if I go by Hobbes or Aristotle, they have given a very political perspective, from the perspective of political theory, political thought, we understand how sovereignty is. But from the international perspective of sovereignty, it comes from the idea of Bodin on one hand, who is talking about internal sovereignty, and this understanding of internal sovereignty is something that, which we are actually borrowing from Aristotle, Hobbes, all these people. Apart from that, we also have something called as the external or the international understanding of sovereignty, which comes from international law, primarily given by Hugo Grotius. Okay, which talks about the fact that there should not be any intervention when it comes to the internal matters of the state. So every state enjoys a certain degree of equal status when it comes to the international scenario. Now, keeping this concept, why I'm not able to change the slide? 1 second. Yeah. Can you see the next slide? Yeah. So, in the context of IR, so what I discussed is about sovereignty as a concept. Now, if I have to understand sovereignty and in the context of IR, borrowing from the ideas of Hugo Grotius further, then the conception of sovereignty in the context of IR can be traced back to the time of the Peace Treaty of Westphalia. And that is actually one of the fundamental understanding of sovereignty that we discuss heavily as the starting point of sovereignty in the context of international relations. Now, in the context of the Westphalian model, the understanding is that sovereignty is something that is absolute in nature. So, when I'm talking about the concept of sovereignty in terms of its external understanding of sovereignty, the idea is that it cannot be violated. It is something, it is permanent, and it is something that, it cannot be contested. That has been the understanding of sovereignty that dominated the field of IR, flowing from the Treaty of Westphalia. Now, over a period of time, what we observe is that this theory of sovereignty, or the conception of sovereignty rather, has been contested when we see it comes in challenge or comes into confrontation with the issues of human rights. So, whenever there has been human right violation, particularly in terms of cases of genocides, in terms of civilian conflicts that have happened within the domestic territory of the state, then this dilemma related to sovereignty has always come into the forefront. The dilemma lies where? The dilemma in the sense that whether to intervene or not to intervene when there is violation of human rights within the territorial sovereignty of a nation state. So that has been the major conflict or contestation with regard to sovereignty whenever we are talking about human rights in conflict situations. Now, the competing mainstream theories of IR have always debated amongst themselves when it comes to what is sovereignty or how should we visualize sovereignty in the domain of IR. For example, in terms of realism, we have seen that, since the realists go by this very notion of state centrism, for them, sovereignty is something that Grotius is arguing in the sense that it's absolute in nature. So, state has the authority to take decisions for itself, so it cannot be violated. On the other hand, when it comes to liberal interdependence theory or liberal institutionalism for that matter, they believe in sovereignty as an interdependent element. So, therefore, you have concepts like complex interdependence by Joseph and Nye, so on and so forth. Now, when it comes to social constructivists believe that sovereignty is something that is related with the identity of the states. So, how states perceive themselves in the international order, right? That somehow down the line helps them to conceptualize what sovereignty should be. So, for example, if I am a post colonial nation state, and as we proceed, we will see India mainly follows that trajectory. So, for them, sovereignty is more about the protection of its territory because of the colonial baggage that these particular countries have. In fact, for that matter, again, to cite a literature, I would suggest that we should read about Muhammad Ayub in this context, who talks about this particular understanding of how these third world post-colonial countries thinks about sovereignty. So then what is India's conception of sovereignty? Given that, there is a conflict in IR in the terms of whether to intervene, not to intervene, is it absolute? Is it not absolute? How do we define this dilemma in the context of India? Now, for India, from the very beginning onwards, I mean, beginning as in beginning of independence, we see that sovereignty has always been like a puzzle in India's foreign policy. Okay. Now, in some articles, it would reflect as, it has been a puzzle. I mean, foreign policy itself is puzzling in the context of India, that, how India perceives itself. But the larger dilemma emanates in the context of sovereignty. At the core of this dilemma is the dilemmas associated with sovereignty, that how India understands this conception of sovereignty whenever it takes its decision in terms of its foreign policy. Now, in this particular slide, if you see that one point I have made, that India's long-term commitment to post-colonial views have been that of non-alignment, non-intervention. But is it only the fact that whenever we talk about non-alignment or non-intervention, we are kind of referring to that protectionist or absolutist understanding of sovereignty? But did India always take this path of protectionism? Again, borrowing that Grotian understanding of sovereignty, that at the international arena, no one should interfere in the domestic territory. So, given the fact that there is a conflict in the terms of understanding what sovereignty should be, okay, whenever there is human rights violation, did India always maintain this stance? Now, I know there is a lot of debate around this, and people, the most common argument that I've heard from my students or in any of the lectures is the Panchsheel doctrine, that people always tend to raise, that India has follows non-intervention, Panchsheel. But India's notion of sovereignty was not so straightforward from the very beginning. So, although India has been a follower of non alignment, India has, on principle, spoken about non intervention, but in the past, India had diverted from this particular understanding of absolutist notion of sovereignty. And how India has done that is something that I have discussed in the following slides, dividing it into three timelines. One is the Nehruvian timeline, second is Indira Gandhi's time period, and Rajiv Gandhi's time period, followed by the post 2000 when you have R2P debate coming into the international scenario. So, in terms of India's foreign policy, as I say, that there is a certain degree of ambiguity, and therefore I won't repeat this slide. I have already discussed about it, that how we are shifting the dimension from the Nehruvian to the post-Cold War period is something that we would be looking into. Now, when we are talking about this shift, okay, then when we are talking about the Nehruvian period, we primarily look into India's foreign policy from a very idealistic perspective to a more realistic notion of India's foreign policy during the time of Indira Gandhi and how it influenced the concept of sovereignty. And lastly, when we are talking about the post Cold War period, how we are talking about, or rather, we are taking a more pragmatic stance when it comes to the approach to sovereignty vis-a-vis, the whole humanitarian intervention or human rights debate. So, therefore, when we are discussing about India's views on sovereignty, we need to address two questions. How do we explain India's normative pursuits as an emerging power? And is there a necessary conflict between India's understanding of sovereignty and the promotion of global norms, such as norms of humanitarian intervention at the international level? Now, like I mentioned, that there is no unifying logic in terms of India's understanding of sovereignty, and therefore we have to look into the historical perspective. Just in the beginning, Sanjukta said that the historical context is important. So the historical perspective needs to be understood through significant timelines. So, looking into the Nehruvian period. So, when we talk about the Nehruvian period, again, while we are coining it to be a very idealistic phase, but when it comes to sovereignty, India had a very concrete understanding of what sovereignty would look like at this point of time. Now, India's reflections on sovereignty could be seen in the context of its anti imperialist stance. That is one thing. And the anti imperialist stance could be seen in terms of its own movement, own struggle for independence. That was one. But at the same point of time, how it connected that anti imperialist logic in terms of uniting with other similar battles, in what commonly we know as the Afro-Asian unity. Apart from that, when we are talking about India's interventionist approach, that, sovereignty is not something that is absolute, but it can be contested whenever there is an imperialist intervention, whenever there is, say, for example, another point would be fight against apartheid in South Africa. In all these cases, India did took a stance. In fact, for that matter, during this particular phase, India has sent the highest peacekeeping officials, particularly if we look into cases like Congo and Korea. So what do we understand in terms of sovereignty? If we look into all these examples, that sovereignty was something that is more volatile in nature. It was more flexible in nature for India. It was not something that was very rigid in terms of India's understanding. Uh, it's the same thing, so I am not going into the details of it. Again, something that I've discussed. Now, what happened after the Nehruvian decade? So, after the Nehruvian decade, when we are looking into Indira Gandhi's phase, okay, so during the time of Nehru, what happened is the examples that I cited, be it the apartheid or be it the Congo crisis or the Korean crisis, when India took a stance, India at the same point of time took a stance keeping in mind the norms and principles of the United Nations. But after the Nehruvian decade, when you have Indira Gandhi and Rajiv Gandhi's timeline, India went ahead and it contested the notions of sovereignty, particularly if you look into Pakistan and Sri Lanka. These are the two broad cases that we can discuss where India did contest the sovereignty of Pakistan for the liberation war of Bangladesh. So, when we are talking about these two cases, the 1971 and 1987, in these two cases, both the strategic interests and humanitarian factors were crucial to India in order to or rather, both these two considerations have shaped India's understanding or discourse on sovereignty. So again, we see that sovereignty, even at this phase, was not something that is very fixated. It was something that was more contingent, it was something more flexible in nature. So, while one part of the argument is, of course, the strategic interest part, but India did take a call because of its own domestic pressure and so on and so forth, where it went out of its way and did play a key role in these two particular warfare. Now, what happened in post Cold War years? Now, in the post Cold War years, one is that what we observe is the disintegration of the Soviet Union. Now, in the 1990s, with the disintegration of Soviet Union, India's focus on this understanding of intervention changed. Okay. And while one reason is because of the fact that, India's erstwhile companion, which was the USSR, that was gone. But another argument that often comes in this foreign policy discourse is the fact that the Sri Lankan warfare was like a key marker for India, that India cannot intervene in its neighborhood whenever it wants to, even if it is for the sake of human rights. So that was one narrative. Another narrative which emerged in the 2000 decade was in the context of the new debate, which was the responsibility to protect norm. Now, the R2P is a three pillar mechanism. So, the three pillar is, the first pillar talks about the fact that the states can, as the states have a responsibility to protect its own citizens in cases of atrocity. Pillar 2 speaks about the international community helping these states in protecting the civilians. And the third is, when Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 fails, then the international community using Chapter 7 can militarily intervene in the territory of another country wherever the conflict is happening. Now, the problem that India had is with Pillar 3 and not with Pillar 1 or Pillar 2, because it speaks about capacity building and helping in through other mechanisms. But Pillar 3 speaks about a direct military intervention. And because of that, India had started contesting this particular notion because it has been misused in different contexts. I have mentioned about Libya in this case, but it was also misused in 1999. Uh, Although the R2P came in 2000, but in 1999, even humanitarian intervention as a concept was misused during the Kosovo War. So, because of the Kosovo crisis, because of the Libya and Syria, all these cases, the global south countries, including India, became very skeptical about norms like R2P, considering that they have a very colonial undertone to it. It's a very Western model, Western way of looking at intervention, and it does not cater to the needs of the global south countries. So they want to rewrite the language of R2P, keeping in mind the context of the sovereignty and discourses from the global south, because clearly it has violated the sovereign considerations of countries like Libya and all, and they have argued that it has been used as a pretext for regime change in these countries. Now, therefore, under Modi's tenure, we see that there has been a fundamental shift in the understanding of what sovereignty looks like. Rather, from being more, contingent, we are gradually moving towards a more rigid conception of sovereignty. And because our conception has become more rigid in terms of sovereignty, it has become more absolute in its context. Therefore, under multi alignment, we have seen that India has tried to abstain itself from cases like Ukraine, or it has not taken a stance in terms of Palestine. Now, we often see it through the lens of criticism, and I totally agree in terms of the criticism that India should take a stance. But my argument is why India is not doing so. India is clearly not doing so because of that liberalist understanding of R2P norm, that it has a Eurocentric undertone to it. And that is why India has even refrained from imposing sanctions. So, one part of the logic comes from the fact that, India has been an ally of Russia. So, yes, that's a very common logic that you will find it in newspaper also. But the broader argument has been how it has seen these norms to be a challenge for India's sovereignty or the discourse of sovereignty. And that is the reason India has refrained from taking a stance in these cases. So, when we are talking about the sovereignty paradox of India, so like I say, through three shifts. So in 1950s and 1960s, when India had a very universalist understanding of human rights and so on and so forth, it questioned sovereignty, but like I said, within the boundaries of UN. In 1970s and 1980s, it took certain unilateral stances, particularly in cases of Bangladesh, as well as in the context of Sri Lanka. And gradually from 1990s onwards, we see that India is moving towards more individualistic and rigid understanding of sovereignty. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Biswas. I think we will now invite our discussant, Vidushu.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Yes.
Good evening, ma'am. Good evening, ma'am. So, I think as a concept, sovereignty is something that has is become like a sticking point in our conversation related to IR, particularly in the light of, as you mentioned, Palestine, the kind of neutrality, or as experts are calling it, strategic neutrality, that India is maintaining towards the situation in Ukraine as well as that in the Middle East. And there are a number of factors that experts talk of as we see, whether it is about economic sovereignty or about securing our own security in terms of oil, etc. But as the last slide also mentioned, that India's context of sovereignty from archaic to present times has been very fluid, in the sense that even back in the Nehruvian time, there was the contours of sovereignty were not rigid in the sense of the how we define the term, that there were exceptions, there were transgressions, but those transgressions were much more defined and much more, I would say, much more myopic in scope. But as we are traversing, as we are seeing that from Nehruvian to the current time, we're seeing that the way in which India defines sovereignty, that has become much more no, it has become a very case specific. That is one thing. And the other thing that we see is the fact that there is also this growing delusion with the Eurocentric narrative that these which I feel like uh, I mean, that could be political to say, but I feel like in Nehru's time, it was much less. Maybe because the concerns of our foreign policy were also not that much related to Eurocentrism. But now we're seeing that India has started having that critical kind of a lens towards all these, I would say, blanket concepts that are being pushed forth on India. And we were seeing our foreign minister increasingly being critical of that. So, ma'am, I would personally want to ask you something, that how do you feel that this concept of that the redefined concept of R2P has changed the traditional idea of sovereignty for
Okay.
India's context, in India's context?
Okay. That's it, right?
Uh, we can
That's
build
the
forth.
first part, right? Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's the first part.
Yeah. So you want me to address it right now?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes. So I would like to say two things. Okay. One thing is Again, something that, before you people joined, we were having a conversation and we were talking amongst ourselves. Firstly, I don't really think that India has suddenly become critical. Okay. Now, yes, in terms of the intensity, in terms of highlighting this Eurocentric biasness, that has become more prominent under this particular government. But in terms of being critical, if you go by the Nehruvian period, right, one point that I did not discuss in this over here, but it is also one of, I mean, I have discussed about it in my PhD or in other aspects. India had been critical during the time of the making of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the UDHR. So, all the global south countries had a different voice in the UN platform. Like, while most of the global north countries, if we may call them global north at that point of time, because the terminology was very different at that juncture, so, the global north countries, their main understanding was that they want the political and civil rights for themselves, and clearly they were coming from their perspective. But what about these third world countries, the third world global south countries? Their notion was they wanted the economic, social, and the cultural rights. These rights to be the predominant rights, and that is the reason why there were two covenants in the UDHR. So India has always been critical. Okay. And again, this entire discourse that I have talked about in today, it comes from the literature of Amitav Acharya. He's one of the key, he should be the key discussant of this particular topic, right? So he clearly writes who are the norm makers. So when he's talking about the who are the norm makers, it starts from that context that countries like countries from the global south, they have always been critical. Okay. Now when you're asking about how they have rewritten the origin, to what extent they could rewrite. Okay. Now here lies a debate. Now when we are talking about these global south countries, they are mainly there is a debate in terms of whether they're emerging powers, they're middle powers, or they're rising powers, right? So most of these countries, if I have to club them, they're rising powers, including India. Now the rising powers, to what extent they could rewrite the norms of the liberal international order is still a debatable topic. Could they really? So we talk about the agential role. Okay, so when we are talking about when we are talking about the Eurocentric biasness, we are talking about the epistemic agential role of these countries. But to what extent they have been successful in rewriting it, that is still a debate. That is still, we can say it's a work in progress kind of a thing. Now, one argument that can be drawn is that their contestation itself is seen as rewriting the language of R2P. The very fact that they deviate from these norms and contest these norms in the global international scenario is itself their way of rewriting the language of this norm. So that is one, that the deviation is equal to their rewriting of the norm. So that is one way of looking at it. But if I say that they have formulated a parallel alternative understanding of R2P, then no, that has not happened yet. So that would be my answer. So there's no clear yes and no to this. Yes.
Also, ma'am, there's another thing that we speak of and we hear about a lot these days is about the fact that India is now increasingly seeing itself as this rising civilizational power or something, something which is becoming a key tenet to kind of frame its rise in the global order. So, do you believe that this idea of strategic autonomy that India always avoids joining any formal coalition. It could be because of the kind of image of subordination that comes with it, or it could be because of the strings that come with those formal coalitions. But do you feel like this strategic autonomy, like for particularly in the case of Gaza and Ukraine, that to assert its strategic autonomy, sometimes it tries to dilute the sovereignty aspect.
Is it diluting the sovereignty aspect, or is it strengthening its sovereignty aspect?
No, but I would say in the R2P context, when you try to take a stance which seems
In
to
the
be
context of Ukraine, you are saying, right? What about
and Gaza
Ukraine's
particularly.
sovereignty?
Yeah.
Sovereignty of Ukraine being invaded by another country.
Yes, ma'am.
It is diluting, because here the larger argument is sovereignty in terms of its own absolutist understanding of sovereignty, right? So, again, there is a parallel norm which, along with R2P, is one of the norms in UN. There's another parallel norm in UN which is called as Women, Peace and Security Agenda, the WPS agenda. Now, if you look into the WPS agenda also, particularly in the context of Ukraine as well as in the context of Gaza, right? India's foreign policy does not take into consideration about the WPS agenda at all. At least in the context of R2P, it initially did not believe in R2P when R2P emerged in the decades of 2000, but in 2005 it agreed to the norm. But if you go by WPS agenda, this other norm, India never have any feminist. So the WPS agenda has a very feminist undertone to it, although there are debates pertaining, there are gender centric debates associated with it. Not going into that, but it is another feminist centric norm. But India does not have a clear cut argument pertaining to the WPS agenda, even in the context of Gaza, okay, or in the context of Ukraine. So India have diluted. So what you're saying is right. But when it comes to its strategic autonomy part, in this process, it has strengthened its own understanding of sovereignty in related to its own identity. So it's more about its own identity. If you remember S. Jaishankar's one of the speeches, I think in the context of, yeah, in the context of Ukraine war, very in the very initial timeline of it, 2022, 2023, he says sir, what lies in our own interest. Something of this. I maybe one or two wordings are here and there, but what lies in our own interest. So clearly, the argument is how. So that is why I am making this point, the rigidity about the conception of sovereignty. So it's not contingent anymore, flexible anymore in terms of human rights. It's more out of that argument that, how the liberal, or rather, in the liberal international order, the US led liberal international order have violated R2P. So it's more like protecting its own sovereignty from that liberal international order, rather than taking a stance in the context of these countries where conflict has. And that is why the rigidity.
Yes,
Yes.
ma'am. So, ma'am, like if you say that, so India is assuming two kinds of positions, I would say. So one is that sovereignty is sacrosanct, it cannot be violated, etc. And the other one, which is some, I mean, which is about R2P, which we could say is that it's a normative power that seeks to protect, wherever these kinds of humanitarian transgressions are taking place. So, ma'am, do you think it's a recent trend, or this has been there time immemorial, that India has I mean, one could be the R2P argument that US has been a hypocrite. They've done it themselves, and they framed it for their own at their own disposal. But do you believe that if we kind of, for 1 second, if we detach the R2P thing from the normative face that India has as a responsible power, do you believe that India is deliberately deviating from that normative stance in the name of Eurocentrism or R2P being or hypocrisy, or however we can frame it that way? Do you feel like India is tilting more towards the first pole, the sovereignty is sacrosanct pole, and the second pole is kind of diluting in the more recent times?
Uh, I got confused in this question because it was
If I may, I think what she's saying is just not R2P norm that is being diluted, right? If I'm not wrong, but other norms are also being diluted. If I may, for a second, Vidushi, just saying कि uh, you cannot homogenize all the norms in the sense, right? The moment I talk about, or she will talk about R2P and all, R2P itself is still right now is a different use of force is another norm, which also comes very close to this. So, so there are certain norms. At if one norm India is not or is diluting right now, does not mean it is diluting the other norm also. So it has to be seen, I think, in more binary way also. I was gonna
They're
ask.
not exclusive of each other.
Yeah. Like use of force
yes,
and yeah.
yes,
So
but the larger context of this lies within the framework of the rise of global south. The common, you can, I mean, the norms could be seen in an exclusive manner that will act as your empirical evidence. Okay, but each of these empirical evidence connects you with one idea, and that one idea is the rise of global south. Okay, that can be. So when I'm linking it with R2P, I'm basically giving you one empirical citation of how sovereignty becomes diluted or changed, whatever. Okay.
Got it, ma'am. Yes.
Yes.
So, do we have questions from other people? Ma'am.
Sure, Sanjukta has a question.
so Sanjukta has two questions, two intervene. One sovereignty is a concept has always been very much West derived, as you have also said. Uh, Before 1947, post 1947 Nehruvian,
Dr.
our
Dr. Nath, if I may, I think I lost you in between. Can you please repeat what you just said? Sovereignty has been. Could you
it is a concept right now. Also, the understanding of sovereignty is as such is very much Western derived, which is also agreeable because mostly international law जहां से इवॉल्व हुआ इवोल्यूशन हुआ वहां से होगा आई डू नॉट हैव कि कहां से बट हाउ डू यू रिलेटिवली दैट डिबेट आई एम नॉट गोइंग आई हैव टू बेसिक क्वेश्चन one the hypocrisy part if we can talk about in R2P is the case selection that has happened what cases do you really go and have a humanitarian intervention or responsibility to protect is the hypocrisy is not of the norm or there's a norm some
Hypocrisy
states
of who? All the countries in
countries, not India. There, it has always been since humanitarian intervention as a norm when it evolved, be it Libya, be it Kosovo, and the whole idea or the problem that happened with humanitarian intervention that you not necessarily need a permission from that country to intervene, right? Sometimes you can do that. So the paradox itself in international, if you can look at, is the whole idea is if I respect my sovereignty to be absolute, which country and which cases do you think that are we am I giving the same respect to the other country's sovereignty also? One, because that whole I think that is what also as a norm of responsibility of protect, be it Brazil having a problem or India having a problem, global south having a problem, is one the Western hypocrisy when we talk about responsibility to protect.
That is why they are moving from responsibility to protect to responsibility with protect.
Protection.
And that is why this whole, because R2P, when it came into existence, the whole idea or whole debate with R2P was first it emerged as, I mean, it came into existence in the year 2000, that decade of 2000, 2001 precisely, contesting humanitarian intervention. Humanitarian intervention did not have any pillars or anything. It was just like, if there is any human rights violation, the states can intervene. Now, why did humanitarian intervention emerge? It emerged because prior to that, human rights and intervention, these two conceptions were not connected. The states could intervene only if there are two conditions. One, in matters of self-defense, and if there is a threat to international peace and security. Okay. During the time of Cold War, whatever interventions have happened was under these two grounds. And that is why India could not justify itself in Bangladesh war. And it had to resort to the self-defense argument. In 2000, when R2P came into existence, the whole point of R2P was about the hypocrisy that was happening during the time of humanitarian intervention. So, sovereignty as responsibility. That was the, I mean, motto or statement behind R2P. But eventually, what happened is, even when it comes to sovereignty as responsibility, the same problem that we saw in the context of humanitarian intervention, like I gave the example of 1999 Kosovo War, we saw it being repeated in the context of Libya. Now, the moment it happened during the time of Libya, from the case of Syria onwards, the global south countries refused to take a stance on this. Since that time, the deviation has happened. So eventually, the skepticism that the global south countries had about the R2P norm, it came into the limelight with this case of Libya and Syria. So hence the deviation happened eventually in terms of R2P. Now, I mean, I think you're talking about this hypocrisy or this part, right? Okay.
Western hypocrisy and how every norm
Yeah.
we generates in the West,
Yeah.
then half of the foreign policy depends on like we are justifying our stand of not being a part of it.
Exactly.
Do we have other questions? You could also type your questions. In fact, I think Sanjukta and Vidushi did such an extensive job of. In fact, I thought Vidushi's questions really kind of twisted the concept in and around. So, if there are any other questions, we most welcome. And I see Vidushi also raising her little finger because do you have?
Yes, ma'am. Just one question.
Sure.
So, ma'am, do you feel like the reason why India is abstaining or like maintaining this strategic neutrality or like whatever they can frame it in these cases has been broadly influenced by economic interests? Like ever since globalization, like for example, when I believe the Kuwait invasion happened, India was quite critical of it. But when, I mean, on a similar, I think 2003 is when I think Iraq was invaded by the United States and India was silent. So, do you feel like economic interest, even in the current context, like Ukraine context, seem to be quite applicable? So, do you believe that
And in the
increasing
context of Gaza, it is applicable.
it is applicable?
Yeah.
So, do you believe economic interests are primarily, or globalization primarily, has kind of shaped how India conveniently kind of shifts the contours of how it would define these interventions or how it would justify these interventions?
Globalization, I would say the connection with globalization only lies with the idea of multipolarity. Okay, so as we move towards the 1990s decade and the world order became more and more multipolar, and in fact, I have written in one of the slides, I've mentioned that in the 1990s decade, after the Sri Lankan case, India's focus also shifted because in the 1990s, with the disintegration of the Soviet Union, its ally was gone. And at that point of time, in fact, after Rajiv Gandhi's death, our condition in terms of the economic health of the country was equally not good. So then, when we have the three forces of globalization, liberalization, and privatize, the LPG, as the Gen Zs call LPG in short term. So when we are talking about the LPG also, uh, the LPG pushed the world order to become more multipolar in nature. Now, with multipolarity, what has happened is India, in terms of its economic interest, a lot of changes have happened. particularly, in terms of being a partner, or I mean, not just partner, I mean, being a member in terms of WTO. Okay. Or for that matter, the rise of BRICS. So that angle is there. That is another component to it. But since the focus has more tilted, I mean, the focus has tilted towards the economic interest, its whole understanding of flexibility of sovereignty, it has become more cautious in nature. When to intervene and when not to intervene, because now a lot of things are at stake. And in a multipolar world order, India has to maintain its relation with each of its, bilateral partner that India has. For that matter, the very reason why India has de-hyphenated its foreign policy in the context of Israel Palestine. Right. So the popular understanding is that, the India going with the dehyphenation, because if you go by the earlier governments, none of them had a relation with Israel. But now India maintains a relation with Israel, clearly saying that India's policy towards Palestine is independent. Now, whenever I say independent, I am serving my economic interest, but I am diluting the whole aspect of sovereignty and R2P in that context. So selective biasness, you can call it. Yeah.
Interest-based.
Interest-based or interest-driven rewriting of R2P.
Yeah. Thank you so much, ma'am. It was very informative and intriguing. If anybody else has a question, they could just put forth.
I think Jigyasa, you had one question you told me in the beginning.
Yeah. Of course, one question I had that I asked you only, that how do you work with a material which is so facile and it's moving all the time? Which of course you answered, and I liked what you said about the flow is the material, right? So it keeps flowing in and you keep flowing with it and you keep making your flow.
Correct.
So I'm going to repeat it because we were not on record at that time. But my second question, and I think you seem to have answered it already with the last bit that Vidushu kind of put forward. I was wondering if we were already also not rigid about sovereignty, Indian sovereignty to begin with. And why I say that is when you look at, say, for example, and I'm taking my cue from what you said about the global south in an emerging space right now. So it is a force to reckon with. Whether it is a force to reckon with because it has the kind of numbers that can work for an economic, self-sufficient world, or whether it's economic interest, or you have much of global south now on an emerging, technological, economic, whichever way we look at it, which is what we did not have, say, in Nehruvian time, and therefore normativity or normative foreign policy stand, or the strategic non-alignment itself was also a project of securing your sovereignty with whatever you had. And what you had at that time was perhaps not this confidence of being a superpower or a power for that matter, but a newly independent state which could provide, normative or moral order. And therefore, it was imperative at that time to secure your own sovereignty, to intervene and take stances and send help or take positions as they were taken back in the day, because that kind of intervention secured your sovereignty, quote unquote, within the space of non-alignment, to say, well, we have nothing to offer, but we're moral, post-colonial, and we're going to be with, the whole decolonizing project. To now where that non-alignment in that fashion perhaps is not workable anymore because we've already taken the normative. And now what we have is that we're also a part of an emerging world order where within multilateralism, there's a possibility for global south, and India within South Asia has the capacity to come back and say, in the words of our foreign minister, that Europe thinks Europe's problems are world problems, but we don't no longer think Europe's problems are world problems, because we now probably are a force to reckon with in our own merit. And I was wondering from that perspective, if we were to take the normative gloss out of Nehruvian non-alignment and think of it in terms of Sanjukta mentioned when we were off the record that it's ultimately, it comes down to realism, it comes down to pragmatic self-interest. What is this really really a focus shifting from we were more loose or fluid or flexible with sovereignty, or is it that we were always very tight about our and therefore based off the positions that were available to us, we were willing to, from, in that sense, there's perhaps a thread of commonality between, or there has been a consistency in the way our foreign policy has looked at the sovereignty of others. The only difference being that we were a new nascent nation during Nehruvian foreign policy, and we seem to have come 75 years, 70 years, 60 years away in terms of both economic growth and ideas and what India has to offer now. So yeah, that was my those were my thoughts when I was listening to you, that perhaps there's a could that be also be the case? Yeah, that's it.
Okay. So I just want to make one comment in this particular context. So I partially agree with you, but I do not fully agree with you on this. The reason for that being firstly, when I'm talking about normativity, I'm not really talking about normativity in terms of morality. I'm talking about normativity in terms of norms, the normative power of a nation. Now, when I'm talking about normative power of nation, it actually comes from the norms literature in international relations, which is part of the constructivist literature. So my argument flows from identity, so the post-colonial identity, norm making, norm taking. So the fact is that earlier, if I have to look through the lens of normativity and see the transition, then earlier India was clearly a norm taker. So India was clearly a norm taker. It made its stance, it had its notions, but at the end of the day, it followed the rules of the order. If we bring about the order versus justice debate in this, right? So India was a follower of the order rather than justice. Now, during the time of Indira Gandhi, when I'm saying it has become more realistic in nature, right? When India actually took unilateral decisions and, violated violated the sovereignty of other country for protection of so-called human rights, then India became more of a norm breaker in its own right. Now, these are not my terminologies. I'm borrowing from David Malone and Rohan Mukherjee. So they write extensively about this, like it is their literature. Okay, so they have the ownership of this. And then when we are talking about in the contemporary times, the debate actually revolves around, is India now a norm maker or a norm setter? That is the larger debate. So when we are talking about the Modi's timeline and India making its or taking its own stances, the whole debate of like Vidushi mentioned about the strategic autonomy part and so on and so forth. Can the global south set norms for itself? So that is the reason why I said, the deviation itself, the contestation of the liberal international order itself could be seen as rewriting the language. And in fact, the discourse, that is the reason why in IR, the new trend, you can say, because I would say it has a theoretical background to it, but now it has become more of a trend because everybody is talking about it. That is a non-Western scholarship in IR. So in terms of this non-Western IR, now again, non-Western IR is not something new. I mean, those who are from JNU, even in the audience, they all know that B.S. Chimney, Siddharth Mallavarappu, these people were one of the early scholars who have talked about non-Western IR. But a lot comes from Amitav Acharya, Barry Buzan, all these people also. So making it more inclusive. So how will that inclusivity happen? The global IR, is IR truly global? So in terms of making IR truly global, we have to include India, or for that matter, the global south countries. in terms of where does their norm making role lies. So while we are thinking of, India's position to be ambiguous, interest driven, but it is also about how India wants to set its own, set the terms in its own right. That is also another argument.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That really kind of opened up my mind to a very different dimension. Yeah. Thank you. Are there any other questions? It was a very comprehensive presentation, though, and whatever was left was done well by the discussant and back and forth questions that we've had. But if you have any other question, please ask. Okay, there seems to be some clarity here. Okay, Pratham, a vote of thanks is in order, please.
Sure. I think a huge thanks from the entire DAAK team to Dr. Shreejita for this insightful, comprehensive, and interesting presentation. Even as someone who doesn't take a lot of interest in IR, I was just like, it made a lot of sense to me, the questions that were asked. And thank you to a discussant, Vidushu, and to everyone else who joined the session. Thank you so much for taking out time on a Saturday evening and joining us. We hope to see you in our future discussion. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr.
Thank
Biswas.
you. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Vidushu, for your extensive interaction. We'll meet you next Saturday, hopefully with another debater. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.